I'm a descendant of Brigham Young's brother. As a young kid, up till the time I was 14, I was very active in church. But at that time, church lasted all day. This horse drug me and kicked me all the way down the arena. Finally stepped on my chest and pulled me out of there. Well, as this happened, I felt my heart had too much stress. It hurt. It hurt me. And I was the ward mission leader for like 7 years. I was a gospel doctrine teacher. I was in the high council twice. I was a bishop for 5 years. I really enjoyed being a bishop. There was a lot of things that you're not trained to do a lot of the things that you're forced to do. Verse 6 in chapter 1 says the whole vessel is sick, the head, the heart, and the feet. The head is the prophet, the heart is the seers, and the feet is the membership. And all of this is Isaiah telling what the condition of our leadership is in the church today.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 50 of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest was Mickey Young. And Mickey has a very pure heart and a beautiful testimony, and I am just thrilled to share it here on the podcast today. So stay tuned for all this and more on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. Everyone has a journey they're walking, and along that road, we are met with potholes, road bumps, rain, storms, and sometimes just fog. But through it all, we're really just looking for one thing: clarity. Clarity so we can walk with confidence in that next step. There's one source I run to for that clarity. In the darkest of nights, Jesus offers me light that shines through even the thickest storms. Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we find clarity through the one who saves us all. Everybody, and welcome to episode 50 of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest is Mickey Young. Welcome to the podcast, Mickey.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for coming on. Mickey reached out to me, and I'm really excited to share his story. It's kind of more rare that we have like the older generation that comes on and tells their story, and so I'm sure you just have a lot of life experience to share with us today, and so we're super excited. So go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and where you're from and how old you are.
My name is Mickey Young. I was born in Moab, Utah, raised in Wellington, Utah, which is just outside of Price. Moved to Jerome, Idaho in 1980, and I was married in 1977. I'm 72 years old, and I don't know how I got to be that old. I shouldn't have been able to get that old with what I've done, but I've been blessed to make it to here, and still get along pretty good. We spend part of the year in Idaho, and then when it gets cold, we come to Arizona. That's kind of a deal that we've been able to work out through the years, and so now we've got that, and we just got down here last week. So
All right. Okay, so it sounds like you were raised in Utah. So tell me a little bit about the part that religion played in your childhood and what you were like growing up as a kid.
well, we lived way out in the sticks. A little town that Moab is southeastern Utah, and there's a little place out by Dead Horse Point, which is now a state park, uh, that they call Dubinky. And Dubinky was just a cow camp, and it was built right into the side of a bank, and it was just built out of cedar posts, and it was a little two-room shack built into the side of the bank. And when I was born, until I was 6 years old, I lived there. And then my mom and dad moved because my older brother started school. We moved down to what they call Dalton Wells, which is by about 15 miles out of Moab. And from there, uh, my brother caught a ride to school with uh, the principal secretary, every day. And then when I started school, when I started kindergarten, I was uh, only had half a day, but I'd go around looking in the windows the other half of the day looking for my brother, and so they finally put me in the other half of the day too. So I got a full year of kindergarten, and then uh, as we got when I was 7 years old, we moved. from Moab out there at Dalton Wells to Wellington, Utah, and we lived there till I graduated from high school. And and as a kid, as a little kid, I'm a descendant of Brigham Young's brother was a guy by the name of Lorenzo Dow Young, and Lorenzo Dow was uh, in that crew that Brigham Young and all of them was in. But he was a tough man, and he raised quite a few kids, one of which was John R. Young, and John R. was the father of William, and William is the one that built all the roads in southeastern Utah, from Monticello and Blanding and Bluff. And my dad was raised there at Bluff and Blanding, and the tractor that they used to build those roads with, after they quit using horses, the first tractor in that country was on the display at Monticello Park for many years. So as a kid, my dad was a member of the church, but he wasn't active. He married my mother, who was from Kentucky, and she became converted to the gospel after my dad married her. And she was always the strong one in our home. She was the one that took us to church and taught us to pray and taught us to always ask Heavenly Father to help us with different things and so on. My dad, he was more of a cowboy type and didn't care much about church. But my mom pleaded with him, and when I was, I think, 6 years old, we went to the Manti Temple as a family and was was sealed there. And then in shortly after that temple trip took place, my dad started smoking again. And for the next 40 years, my mom cried and prayed for my dad to come back to the church. And then in her later years, when she had a stroke, and we can get into that a little later, but she had a stroke that almost took her life, and my dad got back active in church. So at the end of both their lives, they was both active. And of course, through my life, I uh, had many questions, many experiences that brought me full circle back to activity in the church. But as a as a young kid, up till the time I was 14, I was very active in church. I mean, because we went. But at that time, uh, church lasted all day. It was seemed like it was priesthood in the morning, and then Sunday school, and then that evening was sacrament meeting, and it was just all day. And you'd go home and change clothes and go back to church and go home and change clothes and back. And anyway, all day was, and I learned very early on that I didn't like that. I didn't like I didn't like Sunday. So
It's a lot of hours of church. I've never heard that before.
yeah,
Holy cow.
it took all day. You'd go to I think sacrament meeting was like 8 o'clock or something, and at 9 o'clock maybe, and then right after sacrament was Sunday school, and it lasted for an hour, and then you'd go home, and then that evening you'd come back to priesthood and relief society. So
Hmm.
I was excited when they moved to a block uh, situation. You know, we could do it all in 3 hours and be done with it. You had time to relax around it, right?
Yeah, for sure. So were you baptized when you were 8?
I was. My dad baptized me. Each of us kids, when we turned 8 years old, were baptized. And like so many other people, it was not something that impacted me. It was what everybody did. When you was 8 years old, you got baptized. So anyway, I followed suit, but
Yeah. Okay, so tell us about your teenage years. And so when we're growing up in the church, what was that like? What was young men's like for you? And what was kind of your church life like in the home?
well, I didn't care at all for the church stuff as I started getting into my teenage years. When I was 13 years old, I my dad come home one day and said, there's going to be a little mini rodeo at Price next week. So, do you guys want to enter some of the events? Well, I entered the bareback riding and the calf roping, and I ended up winning second in the bareback riding. And on the way home that night, I asked my dad if I could ride bareback horses, and he says, if you show me you are willing to work at it, I'll help you. And so uh, I bailed in, and with all the exuberance of a young man at 13 years old, I tried to show him I was serious about it. And uh, first thing I knew, he had showed up with 5 practice horses that he bought me, and he had a mare that was locoed as a colt, and she bucked, and so he just started putting me on bucking horses, and that was the school of hard knocks. I had no instruction, had no idea what to do. I just got on, held on. I opened the gate, and they bucked me off, and repeat. And so, so it was a real rough and rocky start. And then he got a guy involved that kind of knew some of the stuff about riding bucking horses, but he wasn't what you'd call a real good coach. But he was a good guy, and he worked with me. And pretty soon I could hold on to him and kind of did some things. And as time went, uh, I was able to go to a school, but as far as my church life in junior high and teenage years, I would go, but my dad wasn't going at that time, and by the time I was like 14 years old, I said I'm not going to church anymore, and my mom wished that I would and asked me to, and I said, I'm not interested. If Dad don't go, I don't need to go. So anyway, Uh, I ended up not going to church from the time I was 14 till the time I was 24. But my dad was a, a real cowboy and a disciplinarian. I mean, he wasn't mean to us or rough on us, uh, like he didn't spank us and that kind of stuff a lot. But if he told you to tend the water, and he come in at 8 o'clock in the evening and ask if you'd tended the water, and you said, yeah. He'd say, well, I've been over there, and I didn't, and our house was 2 miles from where the water was at. And he'd say, well, catch a horse and go back and do it right this time, because it didn't look to me like you'd changed it. And then so we was caught. Now it was like it might be 2 o'clock in the morning, but we had to go do the water. So we learned early on that there's consequences if you don't do what you was told to do and don't do it on time. Well, you might end up going back at 2 o'clock in the morning when it wasn't near as fun. And so that was the kind of dad that he was. And he was also a cowboy in every sense of the word. I mean, he uh, roped bears. At 78 years old, I have a picture of him roping a 6-point bull elk and tying it to a tree so that the hunters that shot it in the front leg could catch it and could find it. And so he was a real cowboy, and a lot of times we would start riding at daylight, and it'd be midnight or later before we'd get back to the pickup after riding all day. And so I was raised doing cowboy stuff, and a lot of it, he never owned anything that to handle livestock with other than the rope and a saddle horse. And so we learned how to handle livestock and learned how to work. Uh, um, and consequently, after falling away from the church, if you will, not going to church, I started, and I was a good kid. I didn't know anything. I mean, I was senior in high school before I realized that the light in Price blinked at 10 o'clock at night. So I was never out at night. I mean, it was just like uh, I was just a cowboy kid, and I delivered newspapers on a horse, and I took horses to break. And so once I got them to where I could break them, or got them broke well enough that I could put the newspapers across the front of the saddle and write them along my paper route and get them to stand while I run up the sidewalk and put a paper in the door or whatever it was, then uh, then I was doing 2 jobs at once. I could deliver the newspaper and also ride the colts. And so I was kind of an entrepreneur from an early age, and I made belts and wallets and purses and that kind of stuff from my leather working skills that I learned in school, and but I knew how to build fires, and Boy Scouts just bored me to death. I mean, it was like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Tie a knot, really? We tie knots all the time. We tie pack saddles on. We tie horses to fences. We tie whatever, and it just was way too slow for my way of thinking as a young man, and I was always bored to death with Scouts. And I know that it's got a great place. There's a lot of kids that wasn't raised with that opportunity, but for me, it was just not the thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Sure.
as I got a little older, uh, uh, then I was learning to rodeo, I was learning to ride better, and that's all I wanted to do. That was where my focus was at. And my mom and dad both supported me in it. My mom always gave me good advice, taught me, uh, that God was always with me if I would just open the door and let Him in. And and then through her life, she really set that in me. Like when I was about 14 years old when we was riding on the mountain, and it was rough mountain. It was nobody's run cows on that mountain since we left there 35 or 40 years ago. It's just really rough country, and we was up there one day, and she got to eating some of the berries along the trail, and turned out that they were in the wrong stage, and they poisoned her, and she was really, really sick. And she told me to give her a blessing, and so I did, and immediately she got better, and we went on about our deal. And she told me later, she said, "Do you realize that that's the priesthood that is working with you, and that's God helping you when you ask Him." And so anyway, she taught me all that stuff. My dad was not the one that taught me that.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like you had, your growing up years, you were still taught like good responsibility, accountability, good work ethic, even though you weren't necessarily going to church, your parents were teaching you good principles. So so you said you were inactive until about age 25. So what shifted at age 25?
Well, there was a lot of things that happened between those times. I was really focused on being uh, a, not just another guy that rode bucking horses, but I wanted to be the first guy from Utah to qualify for the National Finals Rodeo, which there had been the Frost brothers, Joe and Clyde Frost, lived in Utah, but they come from Colorado. They were not Utah natives, and so uh, and they qualified for finals uh, in the '60s. Well, so I'm working at getting good at that, and every waking hour is I was thinking about that, or working out, or trying to get my arms stronger, or my legs stronger, or whatever, to be better. Driving somewhere, getting on practice horses, hauling my horses to the arena, something to get better. So that pretty much occupied my life. And uh, my mom, when I was in high school, I come home one day, and my grandfather, I had never met him until I was like in high school, and he left two horses there with us. One of those horses uh, was an Appaloosa gelding, and my mom kind of liked to ride those higher strung horses, so she was riding that horse one day, and it bucked her off and broke her femur. I come home from school, and she was laying on the couch with a cast from her waist to her toes, and that and over the next 8 years, they or over the next few years, I don't remember how many years it was, but over the next few years, she uh, was going to the doctors back and forth, and one thing led to another, and they would operate on one thing and then another, and pretty soon she had had 8 different operations. And after the last one, she goes in there to find out why she's not feeling better, and they x-rayed her, and they said, "Oh my gosh, we left one of our tools in you. We need to operate and get that out." And she says, "No, no, I'm done. I'm if I die tomorrow, I'm not I'm not doing any more of this. Well, she had had a hysterectomy, she had had a kidney removed, she had had multiple, well, 8 different operations, and none of them related to this bad leg. She wasn't crippled or anything. But anyway, at that time, uh, my dad was the one that started the wild horse and burro program for the Bureau of Land Management. In fact, the first wild horse ever adopted come off the San Rafael Desert, and I got a picture of that. It was a colt that mother had died, and it was following my dad back to the pickup on my dad's horse, right? So when they get to the pickup, the guy that was with my dad says, "Well, Laverne, what are you going to do with your colt?" Dad says, "Well, it's not my colt, it belongs to the government." He said, "We better load it though and take it back and see what the boss wants to do with it." So they took it back to the corrals at the BLM office in Price, and the boss says, "What are you going to do with that?" Dad says, "I don't know. Put it in the newspaper on Tuesday and see if somebody wants to adopt it, I guess. I don't know." So they did that. Well, on Tuesday, there was like 40 people showed up to get this colt. And the boss called my dad over. He said, "Hey," he says, "write this up. Let's submit it." Because they was having lots of troubles with the wild horse deals on federal ground and so on. And so they submitted it and ended up being that it was adopted by the government, the federal government. And my dad was the guy that they put in charge of a lot of the investigations and so on as they was adopting horses out. And so they was having troubles with the wild horse and burro problem that they had in Ridgecrest, California, where there's landing the space shuttles, and they're afraid they're going to wreck one of those multi-million-dollar airplanes there over a burro. So they was trying to get rid of them, couldn't figure out a way to get rid of them. The boss that my dad had in Price at the time ended up being down there, and he says, "I got a man that knows uh, that can do this." He said, let's see if he'll take the job." So they called my dad. My dad ended up taking the job because of the perks and also the early retirement and so on. And they moved to California against my will. I thought, "Oh my gosh, Mom doesn't need to be in California right now, as sick as she is and bad as she's feeling." But they went down there, and my mother went to work in a boot store, and there was a lady come in one day and says, "Oh my gosh, dear, are you okay?" And she says, "Oh, I haven't felt good for a long time." She says, "Today I'm really having a tough day." Well, this lady was into the herb business, and she got my mother feeling good for the first time in like 7 or 8 years. And my mom says, "Really, I got to know this." So she was a little fireball, and she went to work learning how to be an herbalist and learning how to do these things. And she just day and night studied until she had it kind of figured out. And then she helped her friends and a few more people around on the side and so on. Well, about then, my dad was retiring. They cleaned the barrel problem up on Ridgecrest, and I was started my rodeo company in Idaho, and so moved every they moved up to Idaho, and my mom opened a business up there, and of course that went on from there. But in the meantime, I was rodeoing, and in 1976, I qualified for my first national finals rodeo in the bareback riding, and it was held at Oklahoma City at that time. Um, and so I qualified from 1976 till 1986, 11 years in a row there, right? And in that time, they moved to the new building in Oklahoma City, and then from there to Las Vegas, which is where it's held now. So, and all that time, I was wondering, and you have experiences, like during that time, I had friends that was killed riding bucking horses and bulls and so on, and I watched it, and that wakes you up. That makes you say, "Wow, this could happen." And what happens after this? Maybe my mom and dad had something when they was teaching me the gospel and so on. So I started asking questions to all my evangelical friends and my Baptist friends, my Methodist friends. And I had a couple of friends that were LDS, and one of them says, "Hey, I'll bring you a book." And he brought me a Doctrine and Covenants, Book of Mormon, and Pearl of Great Price. Well, I had tried to read that when I was a kid and didn't really understand it, right? So now all of a sudden I'm hearing this for the first time, really, and I'm reading it. and I'm driving down the road reading the book. I'm behind the buck and shoots reading the book. I'm sitting on the airplane reading the book. I mean, every place I'm at, I'm reading the book. And as I read the Book of Mormon, I took Moroni's challenge to heart and said, "Is this book true?" And I got a resounding yes. And in fact, I thought I was going to see a vision. I just felt like my mind had opened up to the point that I might see something that would scare me or something. But I really had a testimony of the Book of Mormon at that point. And so then things was kind of happening. I never let myself get involved with. I didn't want to go steady with any girls till after I'd made it to the finals or anything. So the first one I ever went steady with was the woman you was just talking to on the phone here a minute ago.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
I when I let my guard down, and that's been 48 years. So we've been married 48 years now. But
Wow.
1980, I took her. She was raised as a Catholic and went to Catholic school and so on. Uh, and her mother always told her there's only two things I don't like, and that's Mormons and cowboys. So when she met me the first time, I says, "So how do you like me so far?" And she agreed that probably I'd be all right. But anyway, yeah, we've been married now for 48 years. So, and we got married civilly in 1977, and then went to the temple in 1980 and took. We had a daughter uh, that was 3 years old at the time, and then our son was just a year old when we went through the temple.
All right. So, at what point did you guys kind of become reactivated into the church, and what did that kind of look like for you guys?
Well, after I read the Book of Mormon that my friend brought to me, I was I was I always said to myself, when I get married, I was doing things that wasn't supposed to be doing when through those years. I knew I'd been taught different, but like I was a template cowboy. When I first come on the scene, cowboys were, I mean, the old was kind of going out and the new was coming in, but the old was rough. Those guys, they fought and drank and pillaged the city that they were in. And it was kind of tough for guys like myself coming in because we was on the heels of that, and people in town didn't like cowboys, and a lot of times. And so a lot of times you was caught in situations where there was fight if you want to get in your own car. Somebody's going to stand there and give you trouble. So anyway, it was a tough road there for a ways, and of course I got into drinking, and you know, but I always was focused on my end goal. So it wasn't like I was just a drunk or anything like that. But I did do. I tasted life, and then as uh, as I got a little bit older and started thinking about the things that really mattered, once I got married and so on, I started trying to set some things, prayers with my wife and so on, which was kind of odd to her. And I mean, things were kind of rough at first because we come from totally different backgrounds, and who she married wasn't who I was starting to become. I was looking back to my roots, and that didn't fit with who she married. And so I was trying to bring her along with that, and it was difficult because I thought, shoot, doesn't everybody know this? Isn't this easy enough? And it wasn't from her standpoint. And so it was a tough transition for her. But I am a pretty focused individual, and whenever I said, well, our kids are going to be raised in the church. And by then we had a couple little kids, and of course my mother was a good influence. And my wife liked my dad, and so it wasn't like she didn't believe that it wasn't true, but it took some effort to get her to see all that I kind of scene. And
Mhm.
so we was going to church some, and when I was at home, not on the road, we would go to church and take our kids and so on. And and then, like I said, I had friends that were killed in action or in plane crashes or car wrecks or whatever. Uh, the rodeo arena is actually only one of the places that's dangerous in the rodeo world. You're traveling a lot, and a lot of times it's at night, and bad circumstances, snowstorms, ice storms, or whatever, and you still got to go. So you're kind of always pushing the envelope. And then if you're on an airplane, I coined the phrase one year. I met this gal. I'd always pull my Book of Mormon out and read it while I was on the airplane. And the people next to me, seated next to me, would almost always say, "What's that book you're reading?" That would open the door for me to do some missionary work. And so I got on an airplane at Denver one time, and a little old lady, uh, Aunt B type of lady, was sitting right next to me. And I opened up my book, and she says, what's that? And I says, "Oh, it's a Book of Mormon." I said, "Are you familiar with it?" She says, "No, I'm an atheist." And I said, "Really?" I says, "What's that?" And she started telling me, "Oh, the Big Bang Theory and how everybody, I says, "Well, that makes me a half brother to a peach seed then." And I just kind of joked with her, "Well, as that flight went across the wilderness area between Colorado and Salt Lake, the pilot come on and said, if you'll divert your attention to the stewardess, she can reacquaint you with the crash landing procedures." And of course, it gets really quiet on an airplane when they say that. And so, anyway, she told us that uh, the crash landing procedures. Then he came back on and he said our landing gear is not responding, and so we've tried to use our manual and it's not working. And so we've called ahead, and Salt Lake's going to foam the runway, and we will belly in on the foam. But when that happens, we oftentimes don't have as good a control as we should have. And so it could end up in a crashing situation. And so now it gets really quiet, except for those people you can hear on the airplane praying. And I looked over, and this lady had her head down praying to somebody, and so I coined the phrase then, "There's no atheists on an airplane that's going down." And that's just how it is. I mean, I tell people you can't hurt ducks. Ducks will go every direction, like domestic ducks. You try to get them over here, and this one goes off over there, and this one goes that way, and they're always going a different direction, unless you bring a dog on the scene. Now they just bump right together and get right at your feet, right? Because they're
Mhm.
afraid now that there's something that could injure them, and that's
Mhm.
people are like that. And so it's when we perceive a threat, then all of a sudden we're listening. And so that's kind of how it was with me, I think, is these things that were happening around me and to me and to my friends. Uh, and not to say that I didn't have some pretty close calls when I was riding bucking horses. And there was actually one time where I thought that I may die on the spot. And so that was when I said, if you'll let me raise my kids, I'll do everything I can to further your work here. And so those was the things that brought me back to the straight and narrow.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so you're back on the straight and narrow. You're going to church, reading your scriptures, having these experiences. So, kind of as you were raising your kids and going later into your years in life, what did the church and the gospel look like for you? And maybe share some of the spiritual experiences you had kind of later in your life.
Well, I was all in with the church. Once I had that experience in Hayward, California, what happened is my bareback rigging slipped under a horse's belly, and of course, your hand can't come out of there unless you're on the same side as your hand goes in. if you're across it, then your body weight holds your hand closed. So anyway, this horse drugged me and kicked me all the way down the arena, stepped on me, finally stepped on my chest and pulled me out of there. Well, as this happened, I felt my heart had too much stress. It hurt. It hurt me. And so anyway, I had bumps and bruises. I knew what that felt like, but my heart was doing crazy things, and I was bleeding internally. I was spitting up blood and stuff. So I knew that I had some stuff going on, and I knelt down behind the bucking chutes. I got up from the other end of the arena and hurried back behind the bucking chutes, and then said a prayer. And that's when I promised God that I'd do everything that I could. And so from that time forward, I did, and I have. And because it wasn't a religious thing. It didn't have anything to do with the church, four walls and a steeple. It had everything to do with what I promised God, and I knew that He was listening, because by that time in my life I had seen multiple times when He was absolutely present. And so from there, I was anytime I was at home, I was in church. And I was the ward mission leader for like 7 years. I was a gospel doctrine teacher. I was in the high council twice. They called me to be the bishop. Um, I was a bishop for 5 years, ward mission leader again in that ward, and then the stake mission president. And then they took the stake mission president job and relinquished it back to the bishops. So then they called me to be the bishop. That's when I was the bishop, and so missionary efforts was always in the forefront of my service. And uh, I tried hard to keep my home teaching up. I tried hard to keep my temple attendance up. I was all in. I was absolutely a player. And
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about your time as a bishop and what that was like for you?
I really enjoyed being a bishop. There was a lot of things that you're not trained to do a lot of the things that you're forced to do. If I could go back and be a bishop again, I would do it differently, because I didn't realize the church had the kind of money that they've got, and there was times when I was just being so frugal with the widow's mite that there was people I could have helped if I'd have known that there was those kinds of funds. But I was really involved with the youth. I loved the youth. In fact, they asked for 8 kids to come to the temple to clean the temple grounds at Twin Falls, and I had 38 kids that wanted to go. And so I says, well, let's all go then. We'll just finish it up quicker if that's the case. Well, when we got over there, we was the only ward that showed up with any youth. And so they just handed me the keys and said, here's where the garbage bags are, here's where the dumpster's at, here's where the tool shed's at, do all this stuff. When you get done, lock the tool shed up and leave. And thanked us for coming. Said, well, this is awesome that one ward would show up with 38 kids, right? So anyway, we cleaned up around the temple, and then I took the keys, locked the shed, and went run up the sidewalk. Of course, I'm dressed in chore clothes, right? Because we're working outside. I run up the sidewalk, took my hat off, slowed down, opened the door to go in to give the key to the front desk, which is what they told me to do. And as I opened the door, there was 2 women coming out from working in or serving in the temple. I think they were just patrons, but anyway, they was walking out, and they seen me coming in, and so they stopped right in front of me and kind of stepped in front of me and says, "Can we help you?" And I said, "Oh, no, thanks," and just stepped around them and give them a key to the guys at the desk. And of course, I knew both of them, and I stood and visited with them for a minute. And these ladies standing there and watched all of this, and they just couldn't believe that they had let somebody as unruly as me in that temple, right? And dirty. I mean, I wasn't cleaned up and polished like I should have been, right? And I thought then I hope that's not rampant in the church, but I found out later that it kind of is. But anyway, we did lots of service projects. We did one service project at a camp in Big Smoky, um, and we pretty much revamped the camp in 3 days. And uh, it kind of sent a shockwave across, even down the Salt Lake. They sent word up to me that they'd never seen a project done like that. But I knew that we didn't have all the stuff that we needed to do it with, and all, meaning permits and that kind of stuff. And I knew it had to be done quick and right. And so I had like 7 stakes, and I just called each stake and said, I want 8 or 10 guys from each stake, and all of them need to be either professionals at what they do, electricians, painters, plumbers, whatever it was. And we blew in there, and in 3 days we turned that place inside out and made it new again. And when we left there, you couldn't tell we'd been there, except that it was better. And that gained a lot of accolades for the church, and so it was a good thing. And I mean, I was all in. I was involved in church. Everything I did was with the church. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't do anything else on Sunday. I mean, somebody say, "Hey, you going to do this?" No, no, not on Sunday. We're not going to do it. And anyway,
Okay. All right. So super faithful member, served as a bishop, all these things. So now let's get into your awakening journey. So what happened? Like what changed? What was your first step?
well, 2019 come along, and we was in Arizona, and was it 19 or 18 when uh, President Nelson or the president uh, called the missionaries home. Do you
I think
remember
that
that?
was I think that was 2020, wasn't it? Like right after COVID, right?
I can't remember exactly how the events went, but anyway, we was in Arizona, and they told the missionaries to come home, and I just we wasn't we wasn't through down here yet, and I told my wife, I says, load the suitcases, because I'd always heard that whenever they called the missionaries home, that was the last hurrah. We was ready for a wreck then, and so I gauged it by that, and we went home, and then we got a text from the stake saying that we had to have a mask to come to church, or was it? Did they say that we couldn't come to church? Maybe the mask mandate came later, but anyway, when they mandated the mask, I called or texted the stake president, and I said, who made this rule? And he said, oh, it was our area authority. And so I texted him back, and I says, did he get that information from his doctor, lawyer, friend, and scientist friends, or did he get it from the Spirit? And he said, oh, he got it from the Spirit. And I said, no, he didn't. I said, the Spirit doesn't talk to people like that. The Spirit doesn't mandate. We had a war in heaven over this. Now I'm really looking at him like, what's going on? Well, now I'll back up a few years, like 40 years. I was rodeoing, and I come across southern Wyoming. I got a friend lived it. He's since been killed, but uh, I stopped in to visit with him one day, and he was sitting there. Uh, he had been sitting. He got up to visit with me, but anyway, he'd been sitting there, and he had the book of Isaiah opened up, and I said, "Do you studying that?" He says, "Yeah." And I says, "Do you understand it?" He says, "No." He says, "Not completely," but he says, "I'm getting it." And I said, "Really?" And anyway, so I started then trying to understand Isaiah, and I have been really trying to understand it. Well, so now they mandated this mask thing, and I've been studying, trying to figure out Isaiah. I bought Abraham Gilead's books. I studied Hugh Nibley. I studied, I mean, over all of this stuff. I studied, trying to figure out what is it that Isaiah is telling us, because the Book of Mormon, Jesus is telling in the third Nephi, he's telling us to understand Isaiah. Yea, a commandment I give you to understand Isaiah. So I'm trying to understand Isaiah. So now they've mandated the masks. I'm not going to go to church if they're going to mandate a mask because I'm not wearing a mask. And I was
Mm.
adamant about that. But I need to go to church. So I was going to church and sitting in the foyer. They was bringing a sacrament out to me there. Well, one day, right after sacrament, the bishop comes out and he says, Bishop, come in and join us. I says, no, I'm not going to go in there. He says, yeah. He says, I want you to come in. I says, no. I said, if I go in there, I said, I've been a bishop. These kids are going to see that I'm not wearing a mask, and that's going to be in your face. I said, I don't want that. I want them to believe what you're telling them. And so I'll take the sacrament out here and I'll be done. Well, one couple of 3 weeks into that, the guy who calls to get our home teaching reports was a guy from Utah, and he's got a certified public accountant business in Utah, and he had moved his wife up to Idaho, and so he was conversing back and forth, and she was staying up here. Well, he comes out in the foyer and he strikes up a conversation with me, and we start talking about Isaiah, and he says, well, have you ever studied Abraham Gileadi? And I says, yeah. I said, I got 4 or 5 of his books, but I said, he's almost as hard to understand as Isaiah is. And he says, yeah. He says, he kind of is. And he says, I says, you married? And I said, I never see your wife here. Yeah. He says, I'm married, but my wife's apostate. And I said, really? I said, what's the deal? Well, he tells me a little about her and so on. And I said, oh, that's so. So anyway, I told him, I said, maybe I'll stop by and visit with you. So I went home that day and ate lunch. And then I went on over to his house thinking that I might be able to help his wife see the follies of her ways, right? So when I get over there and visit with him, uh, I find out that this guy's dad was H. Verlin Anderson. H. Verlin Anderson, have you heard of him?
Yeah, uh-huh. I went to American Heritage School, which is all isn't H. Verlin Anderson involved in that?
Well, he may have been. I don't know that, but he
I think
was
he
Ezra
was.
Taft Benson's best friend,
Yeah.
and this
Mhm.
guy was his son that is conversing back and forth to Utah, and so
Mhm.
anyway, he gave me one of his books. The Great and Abominable Church is the name of the book. So I read the book, and I read it. I'm devouring it. Like now I'm really trying to find out what the heck's going on because I know that there's something wrong. Something wrong. So he gives me a couple of books to read, and one of them was this H. Verlin Anderson, who was his dad, and and he tells me stories. He says that, uh, anyway, stories that really spark my interest on that direction. And so anyway, as I'm visiting with he and his wife in their home, I'm kind of taking it on myself as being a self-appointed home teacher, if you will, to try to get her excited about coming back to church. And she says, have you ever read Understanding Isaiah by Robert Smith? And I says, no, I don't know about it. And she says, and so she brings out an original copy. Well, they're hard to find, and I couldn't find one. I tried, and I borrowed hers, and I read it. And when I got done, I says, "Sell me that book." And she says, "I can't sell that to you." She says, "I love that book." And I says, "Oh man." So anyway, when you can find them, they're $395, but I couldn't find one, and so I was kind of really trying to get her to sell me that book, and she wouldn't do it. So she said, "There, got another couple of books I can turn you to," and she told me about some others, and she showed me how to get them, and I got them, and I read them, and one day I'm driving to Utah, and I get a text from her husband, and it says, "I've got the PDF for that Understanding Isaiah," and in that book, it's Understanding Isaiah, uh, Revelations, and Daniel, all in the same book. And I says, you do? And he says, yeah. And I says, send it to me. So he sent me the PDF file. I put it on file at the print office in Twin Falls. And I probably had 20 or 25 of them printed since then to give to different people. Well, I printed one off for me, and they spiral bind it and vinyl coat it and stuff. But anyway, I've probably read that 10 times now, and it is amazing how good a job this guy did. He just take 2 or 3 verses of Isaiah and then explains to you what each of those verses means. And I was so excited. By then, they'd kind of lifted the mandate on the mask. So I'm one of the elders quorum advisors. And because they're splitting it with the Sunday school, they have Sunday school every other week. And there's another advisor. I only have one lesson a month to teach. And so it's my turn. And they told us just, draw on whatever experience or expertise you want to teach at elders quorum. And I said, oh, great, I'm going to teach Isaiah. So I come prepared to teach Isaiah, thinking I'd get through about 4 or 5 chapters, right? Well, the first time I did it, I had about 35 minutes, and I got to verse 6 in chapter 1. So I was meeting great resistance. And verse 6 in chapter 1 says the whole vessel is sick, the head, the heart, and the feet. The head is the prophet, the heart is the seers, and the feet is the membership. And them guys, I asked before the class, I said, is anybody familiar with Isaiah? And they said there was only 3 of us that had been studying it. And I says, do you understand it? And they said, well, not really. But one of these guys is a professor at the college there. And he told me, he says, well, I totally disagree with your author. He says, I don't think the head and the heart is the prophets and seers, and I don't think it was meant for our time. And I said, and at that time, I didn't know for sure, but I went home and found it. But in 3 Nephi 23, 1 through 3, it's where Jesus says, understand the words of Isaiah, for they are great. Yea, a commandment I give you to understand the words of Isaiah. Then in 2 Nephi 25, 7 and 8 says, this book was written for you today. The words of
Mm-hmm.
Isaiah was written for us today. And then I had all the information that I needed for that argument. And anyway, we made it to verse 6, chapter 1, in that 40 minutes that I had, 35 minutes. That night, the bishop come to my house and released me from my calling.
Oh, just for teaching Isaiah?
I don't know. He never mentioned it to me. He just says, you see that, you know. Anyway, I was
Wow.
released that evening.
Mhm.
And so I thought, well, okay. So then I was pretty much knew that, as I studied Isaiah and understood uh, that he was talking about our day, and he was also talking about what the situation was, what the circumstances were that surrounded us today, and that our watchmen on the tower were asleep, or they were like dogs that won't bark, and their teachings are like vomit on the pulpit. And all of this is Isaiah telling what the condition of our leadership is in the church today. And so, that kind of set me on the course. And then that same lady that I went over to convert give me another book. And that book was Whitney Horning's book on Joseph Smith Revealed.
Mhm.
That turned my attention to what the circumstances were in the early church. And because I was
Mhm.
wondering all along, how did it get to here? And then when I read that book, I realized, because I never believed that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. For whatever reason, I kept thinking it's never taught anywhere else in the church. It's never taught anywhere else in the scriptures. It caused quite a problem. And they said that the reason it was practiced is because the Lord needed to uh, raise up a pure generation, if you will, and yet he didn't with Adam and Eve. I mean, they started with two, and so it never fit with me. But when I read Whitney Horning's book on Joseph Smith Revealed, and she backs all of it up with uh, writ, then I said, all right, that's where the problem is. Of course, then one thing leads to another. I get a call from a friend of mine who I hadn't heard from for a long time one evening, just kind of out of the blue, and he says, "So, how's it going?" I said, "Good." He said, "What?" Uh, he says, "You ever hear of like hemlock knots?" And I says, "I've heard the word. I heard the words." Joseph Smith said that, quoted the hemlock knots to him, and he says, "Yeah," he says, "there's a podcast." He said, "You ought to listen to that." So I started listening to some of their stuff, and that made me more sure about some of the early shenanigans in the church. And then as you read and understand more about what Isaiah is saying, you see all of the whole picture just unfolds in front of you. You go, holy moly. I've been reading these scriptures all these years. I didn't see this, but it's there. It's all there. That's what opened my eyes. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
No, you really can't. It's true. Okay, so you're gaining all of this information, this spiritual wisdom. So, what did this do to kind of your perspective in the church? And kind of what did you do in relation to going to church and things like that?
I suppose I was probably active for another year, and then I just kind of phased out. I'd come to Arizona. I've got a ward down here that I've been coming to for, well, I've been through 5 bishops, so I've been coming down here for quite a while. I've built uh, some nice places down here and sold them. I was only in one of these places one night, and they called me to be the bishop up there, so I went back up there, and as much as I wasn't going to use it, I sold it. So it's not like I haven't kind of paid to play the game of church. And anyway, we sold that place, and then after I got released from being a bishop, I came back down here. Knew I had to have a place, so I started over and built another place. And now we're in that place, and so uh, this whole thing has just kind of migrated to a point where I was, as recently as I guess it was in 22, we've got a place up there in Idaho that they asked if they could do a handcart trek on it. Well, it's only 60 acres, but I built a trek route around there that really tested those kids. And, they had to wade and drag those handcarts across a pond and up a rocky ridge that's looked a lot like the rocky ridge that the original deal. And I mean, I was involved in church. Well, these things were kind of happening. The vaccine and all that stuff was going on, and one of the guys in the stake presidency has been. I mean, those guys I've known them all, but for a long time. But one of them was at that trek, and he's called me aside and he says, "Hey Bishop," he says, "what do you think about this vac thing?" He said, "What do you think about it?" And I says, "Well," I says, "I think it's wrong." I said, "I've," I said, "God never one time ever says you need to go get vaccinated to stay healthy. What He says to us is when there's ill among you, use herbs and mild foods." And so I need to back up and tell you that uh, after I quit riding bucking horses, in the last 3 years that I was riding bucking horses, I was producing professional rodeos. In other words, we owned the bucking horses and the bulls and the calves and the steers. So I was putting rodeos on, and uh, and then when I sold that out, we we started an herb business using, because when my mom was still alive and so on, she was doing a lot of good for people. She opened a store up there in Jerome, and people would come from everywhere to see her and have her help them. And she became kind of the one that a lot of people came to. People from Florida would come here. People from other countries would come here. And So she was teaching me some of the things that she was doing, and I was applying it to the horse and the cow world. And so now when I sold my rodeo company, uh, we started an herbal supplement business for horses, dogs, and people. And so that was well on its way and doing good. And but anyway, that's where we went from the rodeo world was into the herbal supplement business. So now, all these years later, they're trying to tell us that we need to get vaccinated, and I knew better. I knew that that was not from God, number one, and number two, I knew that there's lots of antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal herbs that are better suited for the health of the people. And so everybody around me was on an herb program, and we really sailed right through it.
That's amazing. And it's really in line with the scriptures too, and that, they're administering this shot and telling us that we need it to get well. But the scriptures and the war chapters in the Book of Mormon, it talks about how the Nephites had to avoid the poisons that the Lamanites were administering to them. So we're told to avoid poison and then use herbs and food in the scriptures. But then the church is coming out and total 180 from that. Take this jab and we'll get better. It just doesn't line up with the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. And so when the president come out and said you need to get this jab because it's been proven safe and effective, and we need to be good global citizens. Both those was just like rubbing my hair backwards. I said no,
Right.
no,
Yeah.
and so from right then I just said no, I'm not. And now I've pretty much caught on to what Isaiah was saying, and so I pretty much then just I backed up. I just stepped back. Well, then last fall, before we came to Arizona, uh, that same member of the state presidency was playing basketball. I go on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturdays and play basketball with these guys, and he was there, and I said, so I want to visit with the state presidency, and so I set a meeting up, and I went in there, and from 7:30 till about 10:30, I asked them questions and kind of grilled them, and they couldn't answer any of it, and so I said, I asked them, I said, what do you know about Isaiah? Well, I really don't know that much about it. It's just never been something I've really been too interested in. I says, well, you understand that Jesus told us to understand it. And they said, yeah, well, we kind of weak there. And I says, okay, well, and I got one of those books in his hands. And so then this last fall, uh, I come back down here to Arizona. And then when I got back this spring, they called me in for a meeting. So I went, and uh, they said, well, how's it going? And I said, really good, really good. He says, well, we haven't seen you in church. We see your wife, but we don't see you. And I says, and you probably won't. And they says, oh, what's up? And I said, I'm totally disgruntled. I says, help me out. I says, is there a reason that I says, how you coming with understanding Isaiah? Well, we really haven't done. And I see that's the point. I said, I'm not learning anything there. You're not teaching anything. You guys are the stake presidency. You're supposed to be. I said, if I was the president of the church, which I'm not, but if I was the president, and Jesus told us to understand Isaiah and gave it to us as a commandment, I said, I would do everything possible to teach that to my people. If I had to hire the best of the Hebrew scholars around the world, I would have them there teaching my people what he was saying. And I says, why is that not happening? This spring, when that meeting took place, we only met for about an hour and a half. And in that hour and a half, they says, well, what do you want us to do with your membership? And I says, it doesn't matter to me. I said, and 5 years ago, if you'd said that to me, if you'd asked me that, I'd have said, oh, well, let's take. But I says, I said, you've lost me. You've lost me. The reason is because you are not teaching what Jesus wants us to learn. You're not teaching it, and you're not showing anybody how to do it. It's just not happening. So why would I want to be a member of this church? And I says, and if it is true that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and then I stopped and I says, do you believe Joseph Smith was a polygamist? Yes, I do. And I went around all three of them, one at a time, and I pointed at each one of them. Do you believe? Yes. Do you? Yes. I said, okay, let the record show that you was asked. I cannot follow that. I cannot follow that. I said, because either Jesus and God appeared to Joseph Smith, and he is a prophet of God. He did not commit adultery. He did not uh, force himself on younger women. He did not lie and cheat and steal and all the stuff that would have to go along with that model. I said, I can't follow that model. Or was it Brigham Young that model started at? And you got to pick. You can't. It isn't both. Either Joseph Smith was right or Brigham Young was right. And if it's Joseph Smith, quit telling the world that he was a polygamist, because I don't believe that. God wouldn't call a prophet of the restoration to that. And so, anyway, they said, well, do you teach other people? Are you going to teach other people this stuff? And I says, is it not written that if you know truth, you're to teach truth? And they just kind of shrugged. And I knew when they asked that question that was the one that was going to get me X'd, which it did. Just a week later, my grandson qualified for the National Junior High Finals rodeo in Des Moines, Iowa. And I went with him and my son back to Des Moines, Iowa. And I was there one evening. My wife called and said, you got a letter? And I says, is it from the stake? And she said, yeah. And I says, read it to me. She read it to me and said they was going to have a meeting Tuesday night to determine what my future would be in the church. And I said, okay. And so the next morning, I called this same member of the stake presidency and I says, don't have that meeting Tuesday because I won't be there. I said, you wait until I get home, because I said, I live there and I don't want 15 men running around that valley telling people that Mickey Young got into the anti-Mormon literature and fell off the ship. I says, that's not what happened. I said, what happened is I woke up to what the scriptures were saying. And I says, so don't have the meeting. And he says, well, we don't generally do that like that now. He says, it's not a convening of the High Council on these kind of things. The High Council only meets when there's like murder or incest or rape or something like that at stake. And he says, it's just probably just going to be the stake presidency that meets, and you've already met with us. And I said, okay, if that's the way it is, okay. But I said, if you have a council, I said, I want to be there. So just so you know that. I said, in fact, what I would like to have happen is have it at stake conference and have me be the guest speaker and you guys rebut it. I said, that's how I'd like to see it handled. But I said, I know that's not what you're going to do, but whatever. So anyway, just a few days later, I got a letter and they said that I'd been removed from the records of the church. So, and I'm fine with that. I really, 10 years ago, if you'd have said that was going to happen to me, I'd have said, no, because I was all in. I believed that because I had a testimony of the Book of Mormon, I associated that with the testimony of the LDS Church, because to me, they were synonymous. And well, whatever, I've asked questions and they've explained them away, like the polygamy thing and the the Adam God theory and priesthood and blacks and the priesthood and all the stuff. I've asked all the same questions, but now, I mean, I had had no reason to be a member of that church anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a common thing that we all wake up to on this journey is that the church is not God. God is God. And so we
That's
don't need
right.
to be worshiping the church. And when our records are removed, I think we all hit a point where we realize they don't matter anyway. What matters is our relationship with Jesus Christ. So tell me how your relationship with Jesus Christ has grown, and some of the fruits of being out of the church and what that looks like in your life now.
I'm on a trek to try to remove anything from my life that doesn't fit with what God wants me to do. I fully believe that God's not talking about seeing him another time. He's talking about seeing him now. And if we can learn to live like he's asked us to live, we can we can do that. And I haven't done it yet, but it's not like I feel like it's a long ways away. I've been part of many miracles. I have I have absolutely seen a lot of miracles in my life, and so I feel like there are things that I've been privy to, even though I've not seen the face of Christ, that have made me know without a shadow of a doubt that I'm not on the wrong field. I may not have everything uh, lined up the way it needs to be to see Christ, but I feel like I feel closer to God right now than I ever felt before. And the reason for that is because I've removed any barriers of man from my life. It's Christ's church is not four walls and a steeple. Christ's church, and it you don't have to have a white shirt and a tie on to be his church. You have to be pure in heart, just like he said. You have to have a broken heart and a contrite spirit. You have to be teachable. You have to be humble. You have to be the person that uh, would make him happy to see if he were to walk up there. And he's not going to be happy to see people arguing and bickering and complaining and being afraid of things and scared of stuff and mad at the world, and this took me a lifetime to figure a lot of this stuff out, and yet I feel like at this time that God has used many tools to bring me to this point that I'm at right now. And I feel like I said, my life is closer to God now than it's ever been. I'm not afraid of stuff. I'm not in a hurry to do anything. I'm just happy to wait on whatever it is God wants me to do.
I love that so much. When we remove the stumbling blocks out of our lives, the things that are getting in the way of our relationship with Jesus Christ, we witness miracles. And so I love that. And you have a beautiful testimony. So, Mickey, how do you find clarity in your life after all this, after being excommunicated for following Jesus? How do you find clarity in your life now?
Well, it's probably just like everybody else does. Clarity comes from searching for truth, praying for truth, and then living what you hear. When you are absolutely committed to following Christ, you uh, you don't really want to do the things that doesn't put you in that position. And it's I go on a Bible uh, study group. It's just cowboys, bullfighters, uh, rodeo stock contractors, just guys that's in the rodeo world that want to do better. And one of these guys broke his back 6 years ago. He's not been able to walk since then. Uh, he was like second in the world in the bareback riding at the time, and and his whole trek since then has been to try to learn to walk again. And I mean, he is a hoss. He works out. He forces himself to stand up. They put electric shocks on his legs to make him walk. They've done all of this stuff to him. In the meantime, he's dug into the Bible, and he is an absolute warrior for Christ. And I would hope and that I could become that without having to have the injuries to do it. I would hope that I could be that kind of a warrior for Christ, and that's where my clarity is being in pursuit of Christ.
I love that. Clarity comes from being in pursuit of Christ and being a warrior for Christ. Thanks so much, Mickey, for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Clarity. Carry on with the great work you're doing.
If you guys are interested in joining us for an episode of the Clarity Podcast where you share how you have left mainstream religion to follow Jesus Christ, please feel free to reach out to me at clarity.podcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on my website at forgedinhisfire.com, or you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Forged in His Fire. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast.